we tend to interchange sadness with depression.
Yes.
That's what happens, right? Sadness is an emotion. All of us go through periods of sadness based on the experience that we are going through. Clinical depression may have elements of grief and sadness, but it is not centered in sadness. Most people need to understand this socially. Because I think one of the worst things that people who live with clinical depression hear is that cheer up. They are not in need of cheering up. They feel disconnected. Good therapeutic interventions, right, or good therapy, if I was to make it very simple, is a relationship. You're talking to somebody who is going to be non-judgmental or unbiased, who is willing to receive you, right? That, for a lot of people, is the first time they've experienced a safe relationship.
Hi guys, we are back with another great episode of Discovery of an Author. And in this very interesting episode of Discovery of an Author, we sit down with author and psychologist Scherezade Siobhan. Scherezade has written a book, That Beautiful Elsewhere. It is a part memoir and it is also a part a book on her 20 years of being a practicing psychologist and a psychotherapist. This was a very powerful and a very hard-hitting episode specifically for me, because for the very first time I got to understand in depth and in detail the meaning of mental health, the definition of mental health, the difference between depression and clinical depression, what is schizophrenia, what is OCD, what is bipolar disorder, what is multiple personality disorder, lot of these things which usually we tend to ignore in our society. Scherezade is a great author and she is an exceptional psychologist who's been practicing in Mumbai for the past 20 years. For anyone who's interested in mental health, to understand the kind of ailments and issues that are there in mental health, this would be the only podcast that you would want to ever listen to. So I strongly suggest and recommend that you watch or listen to this episode from start to end. You would be amazed. There was a moment in the episode wherein I was silent. I had no words because I was blown away by what Scherezade had to share and say and reveal on the subject of mental health. Watch this episode, let us know in the comments. And if you're liking the kind of authors and content that we are creating, I humbly request you to please subscribe to our channel, to like our episodes and to share them. This is the only way YouTube will ever allow us to grow. Enjoy this podcast and episode. Thank you. Scherezade, thank you so much and welcome to the Discovery of an Author podcast. And it is truly an honor to have you. I have been looking forward to this episode since a very long time. And I am so excited for this conversation. Your book is such a brilliant book, and I'm going to show a book to the readers first. Just give me 1 second. I generally do all my readings on a Kindle because it's very easy for me to then take notes, you know, because in physical copy, even if you take notes, then to write it down, type it down, take the highlights, it takes a lot of time. Right. So I'm going to show the readers your book. That Beautiful Elsewhere. Brilliant cover. This is by HarperCollins. Amazing book, and very, I mean, you are a very brave writer. I mean, I was in awe of the way you have written this entire book. You have written about your own personal life and journey and struggles. Not many people are able to communicate that. And I can just see the depth of your mastery over this subject, Scherezade. This is just it was just phenomenal. And the kind of content that was there in your book. It is the need of the hour. It's high time that people should know about this field, which I'm gonna ask you to explain just in a while. And B, the level of detailing that you have written, the kind and type of things which are there in the mental health ecosystem was just phenomenal. I really want people to buy this book. I really want people to celebrate you as a profession, as a professional in this space, as an author and a writer. And I am looking forward to your next book, which I'm sure you're writing.
Yes.
You know, so welcome again to the Discovery of an Author podcast, Scherezade. Great to have you.
Thank you so much. for making this happen. It is my pleasure, it's my honor, and I'm very glad that you do this because I think this podcast is so incredible in helping us find other contemporary Indian authors. So for me, that's how I found this podcast. And I think there is some great work that's going on with the podcast, and I'm hoping to contribute to what you're trying to create.
Thank you so much. It's always very good to hear such amazing things, specifically from authors, because I always tell people, yeah, I mean, if the authors wouldn't be there, we won't be there. We exist because you guys have read, are writing some amazing books. Sherazade, what we'll do now, I first want you to introduce yourself. I first want you to tell a little bit about yourself. Where do you come from, who you are, and also the field in which you are working, and describe that field a little bit and how many years it has been since you have been working in this field. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Scherezade Siobhan, and I am essentially a practicing psychologist and a psychotherapist, apart from being a writer. I also am an educator, and I think my new feather in my cap is that I am the official dog mother for about 20 odd community dogs in my area. So, those are the roles I play on a regular basis. I have been working in the field of human development and psychological care for about almost now 20 years. And I started very young. I come from a long line of doctors. So, because I could not withstand blood, physical health was not an option for me to study physical health. Though, coming from the kind of family I did, it is a foregone conclusion that everybody should become a doctor, which was obviously not a personal preferred choice for me. So I dabbled in a few things when I was 18 and 19 and 20, and then I realized that this is for me. This is what I'd like to do. Largely, I work with individuals in clinical care, and I have a private practice. I also work with organizations and communities. So my work stretches from doing individual therapy or providing therapeutic interventions to working with organizations when it comes to organizational health, especially focused on mental well-being. And I also work with communities and NGOs, um, with outreach, with community mental health programs. So it's a pretty interesting and varied set of variables that I dabble with on a day-to-day basis. And of course, I like to write. So I like to create art. So I write nonfiction, I write fiction, I edit, I publish, all of those things as well. So that is pretty much a little bit of a summary of me. I come from several elsewheres. That is why the book is also called That Beautiful Elsewhere. There are three different hidden meanings in it. One, it is my own journey because I think I've never had a particular home as such. I've moved around a lot. Um, there is a very interesting storyteller called Martin Shaw. He's a British storyteller. He's a folklorist, which is a lovely title, which is a lovely profession. And he talks about people who belong to all time and no place. you know so I feel like that, and he calls it That Beautiful Elsewhere. So that is what the book also represents, and it also represents that elusive journey that people take through therapy, where they are at a particular position and looking towards that beautiful elsewhere that they will experience. So that is a little bit about me.
Sherazade, I'll also would like to read your bio that is there on LinkedIn, because I think it's very important for people to also understand. So 20 years of cumulative experience as a trained psychotherapist and clinical psychologist, therapeutic coach and catalyst, leadership strategist and facilitator, talent development and behavioral intervention specialist who works with organizations, individuals, and communities towards holistic wellness goals.
Yeah.
And you have also the founder of Curist.
Yeah.
So before we move ahead, tell us a little bit about Curist first.
When I started practicing in India, I realized that the challenges we face here are vastly different from what we may experience in other parts of the world. You know, not to offer a lot of critique, but in a way to offer some critique. I think what happens for a lot of people who study psychology in India and then get some exposure outside the country also, When you actually start practicing on ground, you realize that a lot of conceptual knowledge cannot be directly applied, not because it's invalid, but simply because the circumstances needed to apply that simply don't exist. You know, so when I was studying psychology, or when I started understanding mental health as a science, there was a lot of insistence on what is called individualized experience. If you are experiencing a mental health condition, almost uh, like a covert implication was that you need to fix it. Here are these methods, here are these steps. But as you start working, you realize that mental health issues, challenges, or even illnesses are not so black and white. They are not so individualized. They are a product of the social environment, familial environment, culture, politics, financial privileges you have. So Curist came out of that experience, that at some point I started questioning that, can we even only call it mental health? Because it seems more like psychosocial health, your psychological and your social health. You know, when we provide therapeutic interventions and a person comes to speak to us for 45 minutes, 50 minutes, 60 minutes, then they have to go back to whatever environment in which they have to exist, right? So the idea with Curist, and it's still a developing, I would say, an unfinished, I always call it an unfinished business, right? That we're trying to develop means, methods, outreach, by which we can focus a lot more on an integrated approach and on a community oriented model for wellness, you know.
Scherezade, the problem is
Mm.
that nowadays, okay, I'll see if I can put it this way.
Yeah.
Everyone,
Mhm.
since even when they are very small or in during
Mhm.
their childhood, we are all very much aware of the term physical health.
Right.
Physical health is something that has always been there. It's something that nobody needs to explain. Your
Correct.
body explains it to you
Right.
in its own. And on its own, when you face any physical
Mhm.
disease or physical condition, be it viral, be it fever, be it a cut on the arm or leg or headaches, our entire definition of an entity, this entire machinery not working proper, is headlined by the physical
Right.
illnesses.
Right.
Everything that is physical, and it's very much common. Nobody's debating it. I can
Mhm.
go to my, let's say, my 4.5-year-old son can come up to me and say that, "Ki, Dad, I'm having a headache," and I am not going to dismiss it.
Right.
I I would not even think about dismissing, because in my mind, what he is experiencing is something which exists, which happens to everyone,
Right.
for which I know there is a diagnosis, for which I know there are people out there who's gonna look at him and give him medicines, and nobody is going to judge ki, "Arey, what are you doing?"
Mm.
So physical health, I can understand that you need your physical body to be in perfect condition.
Right.
And if there is an illness with regard and with respect to your physical body, there are doctors out there which are most respected individuals and citizens of this country
Mhm.
and this nation and the entire world, and you can go for a diagnosis.
Mhm.
Now the problem comes with the term called mental health, mental fitness as well, mental well-being as well. I feel that people really do not know what is mental health. They don't. They absolutely do not know what is mental health. So I want to start from the basics. Okay, I really want to go into the definition, because I think these are, as you rightly said, mental health is a science. Like physical health is a science, there are people who are trying to understand how to better the human body. There are people who are in the labs trying to create medicines that can help a body. Mental health is a science. So first of all, Scherezade, tell me, what is mental health? What is this ecosystem? I first want to understand the basic definition of this thing. What do you mean when you hear the word mental health?
The interesting thing is that this segregation between physical health and mental health is a recent uh, part of our social conversation.
Interesting.
In fact, the funny thing is that while, of course, a lot of present day mental health conversations which trace back to psychology, uh, people would like to talk about their origins in Europe or in America, right? But psychological awareness, or the awareness about psychological disturbance or difficulties, you can trace it all the way back to ancient Egypt, where in the Ebers Papyrus, which was a sort of treatise on health, on medicine, there are clear indications and summaries and mentions of depressive thoughts, or the mind feeling some sort of an unrest. Also, what happens is this segregation is a bit superfluous between physical and mental health, because when you catch a flu or when you hurt your ankle, which is a very definitely physical occurrence, it's not like your mind is functioning very well when that is happening to you. When you catch a flu, your mood also dips. you know your mind also feels low, right? The trouble with, let's say, India in particular, or maybe the Indian subcontinent, or maybe with us in South Asia, is that when it comes to health, we are somewhat ableist, even with physical health. Because when you fall ill, you are immediately told that you should not fall ill. You should do something to not fall ill, right? So when we trace back our understanding of mental health, it almost always conflates with madness. We almost always equate it to a very, very
Insanity.
insanity and madness, which are also very, very important aspects of mental health. But it's almost this duality that has been created, you know. And I think there is something fear inducing about witnessing insanity in someone, you know, because I think we somewhere, I don't know for sure, but in my observation, I feel that when it comes to physical health, we trust somebody who is a specialist, and we say, okay, you can operate on me, you can operate on my heart, you know, you're a cardiothoracic surgeon, operate, you will fix me. But I think when we suffer on account of the mind, not on the account of the body, it threatens us, it scares us, because it's very powerful. Our mind is how we interpret the world.
And I think it's an now that you're saying, it's an unknown territory. It's
Yes.
something that I don't know. It's like you're trying to conquer a land which you don't even know
Yes.
exists.
Yes. Yes. And because there is so much, there has been so much of stigma and taboo about it, right? There have been entire, like, centuries of punishing people who had mental health conditions,
Yes.
and you don't want to be considered in that category.
Demonizing them as well to an extent.
Yeah, yeah. So there was a point when we would do this with physical health. Then there was a point we would do it with mental health. With mental health, people were almost punished for feeling unwell, right? All kinds of punishments. They were removed from society. They were treated very badly. I won't say they were treated like animal, because I feel like that somehow makes it okay for us to treat animals badly, which I don't agree. I think we have treated people with mental health conditions as if they should not exist within the society, you know and this has percolated to any form of mental health disturbance. You know. We don't understand that there is disorder, there is distress, there is disease. There are different categories within it, right? Some of them could have very strong neurochemical or biological bases. Some of it is very social, and we have flatlined everything, and we are scared of all of it, because the fear is that, and I still hear this in 2025 in therapy, and I'm very glad that over the last several decades, perhaps in India, there has been a massive leap in conversations about mental health. Social media has helped create a lot of community conversations. But with certain generations, even now, when you discuss mental health, when we do family therapy, and maybe a 22-year-old or 23-year-old wants to seek help because they have informed themselves that maybe I'm dealing with somebody, parents will say something along the lines, "Tu pagal hai kya?"
Absolutely.
Yeah, and or they will say, "Tu pagal ho jayega." You know. So the perception is that if you are dealing with anxiety, that is a steep slope to you ending up at some traffic signal talking to the void.
Gibberish. Yeah.
Yeah. And that also originates from a lot of, I would say, segregation based mindset, that the person who's standing at the traffic signal, who's struggling, they are not a part of us. you know like I mentioned in a conversation, that there is an organization in Bombay that actually this is their job. They find people who are mentally unwell and homeless and try to reunite them or to find their families. and 80% success rate. Like 80% people that you think have just been thrown out on the street, they do have families waiting for them. But because nobody thought about treating the mental health condition, which for a lot of people in these cases tends to be paranoid schizophrenia, they struggle. And then we see that and we flatline it and say that the kid who is experiencing anxiety because they are preparing for an engineering exam is, if they go and talk about mental health, that means they are on the steep decline towards becoming that, you know. So there is unfortunate connotations of weakness that are latched on to any conversations about mental health, you know. And inherently what we mean to say is that we equate vulnerability with weakness, which is a terrible thing.
Scherezade, now I now want to go on to the next terminology, and I want to understand that you are a psychologist and you're also a psychotherapist. I first want to start with the term psychologist. What is psychology, and then who is a psychologist? Let's first understand that. What is psychology, and then who is a psychologist, and what do they do?
So psychology is the study of the mind. The original term means the study of spirit, but spirit here obviously would be indicative of the human mind, right? Psyche is mind in Greek, and logy is a study or research. So a psychologist is somebody who studies human mind, but when we say human mind, in current day practice, it expands to perception, emotion, behavior. You know, I would say probably in a very simplistic way, you can categorize it as the study of cognition, which is thinking and everything related to thinking, all processes related to thinking, behavior, behaving, and emotions, feelings. Emotions would, to some people, they would probably still count it within cognition, but I'm just separating it in a very sort of simplistic way. Psychology is a very interesting and a very vast field, because I think a lot of people think that everybody who studies psychology is a mind reader, which is not true, which is absolutely the opposite of what we do. In fact, a psychologist will probably ask you too many questions, right? So
Yes.
we don't look at a person and we go, aha, I can read your mind, you know. And I used to get that a lot. I'd go to a party and somebody would be like, can you tell me something about myself? And I'd be like, I'm not an astrologist. Okay, so psychology is a vast field where it is not just limited to studying people. You study behaviors, you study trends, you study organizational cultures for that matter. So there are multiple different branches within it. From clinical psychology, which is very essentially studying individual human behavior and human psyche and the impact of it, to media psychology, you know, variety of subsections exist. Psychotherapists are essentially those who practice psychology in a therapeutic format, where they provide therapy or some form of counseling.
So a psychologist won't do that? I mean,
Not necessarily, may not do it. For instance, one of the biggest myths is that people think that all clinical psychologists are practitioners. Actually, it's not true. Most clinical psychologists are researchers.
oh, that is very interesting.
Yeah.
So most clinical psychologists, they are researchers. They are not
Yeah.
somebody who would actually put that research into practice and give you what needs to be done.
Yeah, if they want to work in clinical health settings, that is, they want to do what is client care, patient care,
Yeah.
service user care, that's a different thing. But a lot of people, for instance, when you do your PhD in clinical psychology, you are largely doing a lot of research. It is engineering level math, you know. Counseling psychology, which is another subsection. Yes, counseling psychologists will essentially get trained at PhD level to do absolutely counseling work. Clinical psychologists can also opt to become psychotherapists. What happens essentially, or what is the defining probably divide, is that a psychotherapist then, after getting their degree in psychology, has to then train themselves in some modality of a psychotherapeutic tradition, right? So they can train themselves in, say, psychoanalysis, which is a form of psychotherapy, or they can get trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is called CBT, which is a very popular form of talk therapy, or they can get trained in art therapy. So after you finish your studies, then you will further train yourself in a therapeutic format and gain knowledge to work with people in a therapeutic setting. But every psychologist may not choose to be a psychotherapist.
So let's take it with an example. Let's take it with an example so that we can understand the real time difference between both, right? Okay, so let's say I'm okay. My friend is there who's recently gone through a divorce, or is going through a divorce. That means he and he's that relationship has ended, living separately since a very long time, not able to speak to a lot of people, not able to open up, stuck in his own room, not talking. This example, this individual, what kind of help, what kind of clinical help should this person reach out for or look out for? Should that individual go to a psychologist, or should that person go to a psychotherapist? Why I'm asking this question is that when such a thing happens, people don't even know what they need to search in Google. They don't know what they need. They don't know who they need to go to help them in this situation.
So your psychotherapist will probably already be a counseling psychologist. So the distinction, I mean, it is a subsection. Being a psychotherapist is a subsection of being a psychologist. They cannot be a psychotherapist if they're not a psychologist, right? So if you look for a psychotherapist, the person you're getting, in all probability, is going to be some form of counseling psychologist. The difference is between psychologists and counselors. Counselors, again, it's a distinction of degrees or paper. That a PhD in clinical psychology makes you a clinical psychologist, whereas a master's degree in psychology or applied psychology makes you a psychotherapist. A psychotherapist is trained in a specific modality or some form of psychotherapy to help you. So if you're looking for a psychotherapist or if you're looking for a psychologist, both of those are perfectly fine. The difference is when you look at, for instance, say an organizational psychologist or a sports psychologist who will essentially work in a very, very specialized environment. So when you type into Google therapists near me, that's a perfectly fine way to find a psychologist, because what you will find is a counseling psychologist in all probability, and some clinical folks also. The other major distinction between, say, a counseling psychologist and a clinical psychologist is that clinical psychologists can assess and also diagnose for certain mental health conditions. They cannot medicate. That's a psychiatrist. Who's
So
an
that's
MD,
very,
who's
that's very
yeah,
important.
who's a medical professional who will medicate. They cannot write you a prescription, but they can test you, right? So, for instance, let's say in real time, a person comes to me and says that I have been dealing with these signs and I have done some of my own sort of research on Reddit and talked to my friends, and I feel like perhaps maybe I might have ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So, for that person, a clinical psychologist can administer a few standardized tests to assess if they go to a clinical psychologist. If they have gone to a therapist, the therapist can obviously work with them to deal with ADHD, but to clarify that whether they have it or they don't have it, they will refer them to a clinical psychologist, or they will refer them to a psychiatrist to say, first you get diagnosed, or the determination should happen, and then we can devise the necessary way forward to be able to handle this collectively. The therapist will work with you on therapy, right? They will not be in a position to diagnose you or clinically assess you. Diagnosis also, for me, I'm in a place where I find that to be a bit of a difficult term, but I would say clinically assess a person. If a person, for instance, is depressed because of a certain event in their life, like they have lost a loved one, so they are going through some form of a depressive phase, versus a person who has what is called clinical depression, right? So the therapist will work with both these groups of people. But when a person absolutely wants to kind of ensure that, do I have clinical depression because I'm just not able to deal with this, in a way that I can function, then you may recommend them to a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist, to the doctor, to see if they need any other form of attention, diagnostics, because it is not just situational. Without any obvious triggers or stressors, they are still feeling the same thing for many, many months, right? So that is the distinction. Apart from that, a lot of clinical psychologists work in clinical setup to do research. So the test that you use, that test is also designed somewhere. Someone is working on that, so they do that also.
Makes sense. So in a way, therapist is like a consultant.
Yes.
that comes up, sees what is happening, how we
Right.
can make a company more efficient and effective, and who are the people who can then come in between and then can make sure that everything is happening right now. So they're kind of like a consultant. And I think it also depends on the severity of your condition. So again,
Yes.
we're going to deep dive into a couple of concepts right now. Now, why it's very important, I'm going to start with the depression terminology and clinical depression as the terminology. Now, I understand that these are two different things that again people are using very loosely. Anybody in today's time, talk to somebody who's not feeling well or who's very low, you ask him or her, hey man, what's up? And he or she'll be like, I am depressed, bro, I'm very depressed, I'm very sad, I don't feel like living. And then you're like, bro, if you are depressed, do this, do that. Even Deepika Padukone was depressed, she's this and that, and so many celebrities are depressed. Now that is one thing called depression, and there's another thing called clinical depression. Now I understand that there is a whole difference between both the terminologies. And why I want clarification on this thing, because people are using it very loosely. And the problem with using these terms loosely is that psychologically your brain starts thinking that you are depressed, even if you are not up to a clinical depression. And then you're just thinking about it might push you towards that clinical depression, right? So let's demystify this thing.
So a lot of the diagnostic nomenclature comes from two separate diagnostic manuals. There is something that is very popular in America, which is called the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, or DSM. Okay, so that is largely used for what we call coding psychiatric or psychological or mental health conditions. So it has codes for everything and it has definitions. There is some debate about the concept of diagnostic language, because see, one of the things you have to also recognize within healthcare as at large is that there is an obvious power differential, right? The psychiatrist or the doctor or the psychologist or the person who's considered to be sitting at the helm of affairs will tell you what you have, you know. So a lot of movements have arisen against it, because a lot of people talk about what is called lived experience,
Yes.
right? Lived experience, for instance, a very good example of it is autism, the autistic community. Now, autism, because it was poorly understood uh, maybe several years ago, it was classified in a way where it was like a diagnosis of a mental health condition, where it's not. It's just a state of being, right? And that change in perceiving autism in a far better way has happened because of the people who lived with autism, who fought for their rights, right? So when we are defining, say, depression or clinical depression, we have to also remember that clinical depression as a term comes from a certain diagnostic lineage, which may have its own conflicts. You know, I sometimes, even if I am criticized for it, I say this, that within the psychiatric diagnostic or the labeling conversations, sometimes it feels a lot like the Devil Wears Prada. You know, there's a scene in The Devil Wears Prada where they're talking about blue, how blue became a color of the masses, but it started with this designer using it, and then so on and so forth. So a lot of times you see that certain mental health conditions become trends. You know, so you will see now there's a lot of conversation around ADHD. Before this, it used to be anxiety. You know, it's almost like you have to wait in line to be recognized, right? From a clinical perspective, um, depression in itself is an outcome of a particular condition called affective disturbance or affective disorder, which is affect is your mood, right? So originally it was called, or it is still called within practitioners, it's called moods disorder. And
Moods
disorder,
disorder.
yeah.
Okay.
And disorder is a term that I personally still struggle with, because when we say somebody has moods disorder, how much of that is contributed to a disordered environment? You know, so my conflict with that term is that why are we calling the person disordered when they could be depressed because of a set of circumstances which are disordered around them, right? But for now, we are using the language that's available to us. So it's called moods or affect disturbance or affect disorder. Within that, you have several classifications, basically, right? And the whole section of moods disorder is about those conditions or those disturbances or those experiences of distress which affect your mood, right? So when we talk about what is called clinical depression, which is called unipolar depression, because your mood can be extremely low and extremely high, and everything else is in between, right? If a person constantly struggles with low moods, with not even a speck of somewhat better joyous experiences for a long period of time, 6, 7, 8 months at a stretch, right? 3 months and more than that, then and there is no immediate obvious stressor, right? Now, if you're talking to a person who's stuck in a war zone, that's a different thing. But you are not. You have a somewhat normative life, and
Secured
this is happening.
environment in a way.
Yeah, yeah. So that means you're dealing with what is called unipolar depression, which is clinical depression, right? Because you're not able to toggle. You're not able to move between moods. What happens to us? What is a mood, right? There is a stimuli, something happens, we interpret it and we react to it. My reaction is not proportional to the stimuli, right? So I have, for instance, for full disclosure, I have lived with what is called clinical depression or major depressive disorder for almost what 25 odd years, because I was diagnosed very early in my life. I could be winning an award and I will slip into depression, right? So the stimuli and the response, they don't align, right? It is not just in response to a negative stimuli, right? That is essentially what clinical depression is, right? But feeling depressed could be because of a particular stimuli in your life, or a particular event in your life, or a particular situation, right? So I think what happens in a very simplified way is that we tend to interchange sadness with depression.
Yes.
That's what happens, right? Sadness is an emotion. All of us go through periods of sadness based on the experience that we are going through. If you go through a divorce, if you go through a heartbreak, if you lose a job that you really were very attached to, if you lose a loved one, you will experience sadness, and you will experience a very intense form of sadness called grief. Clinical depression may have elements of grief and sadness, but it is not centered in sadness. Most people need to understand this socially. Because I think one of the worst things that people who live with clinical depression hear is that cheer up. They are not in need of cheering up, they feel disconnected. Clinical depression is numbness, disconnection, dissociation, apathy, right? In fact, the worst form of clinical depression, which is the most extreme form of clinical depression, is when you are completely disconnected from life. Sadness still keeps you connected to something in life, but people who are dealing with intense clinical depression feel completely disconnected, not rooted. They don't feel they belong. you know and I think Jim Carrey had this wonderful interview in which he differentiated, and he said sadness is a feeling that you might have, whereas depression is this constant chatter that I don't want to be this anymore, I don't want to be this person anymore. So it is a lot more than just dealing with one singular emotion, and I think a lot of people don't recognize that depression is very different from sadness. Sadness could be a component of depression, clinical depression. And depression, by definition, means what? It's sinking. That's what depressed is. It's sink, is to be depressed. So a person is sinking. They're getting stuck in further and further inside something. You know, and that's why the antidote to depression is not happiness. It is vitality. It is connection. People who are dealing with depression are not explicitly saying, make me happy. They want to feel something, they want to be connected to something. That is the difference. That's the critical difference. Because sadness related to occasional periods of loss, occasional periods of difficulties, that's an ongoing human experience. Whereas clinical depression is a pervasive and very powerful sort of disconnection from life and living.
Wow. I don't know what to say. I mean, I have heard it this way when you specifically said about connection. They want to feel connected to something. Sometimes it feels as if this is a basic human need. It's as if this is the basic human fabric that is missing from somebody's life. That is an essential of what makes you a human being, of what
Yes.
makes you a community. That has been stripped away from an individual. How would you it's
How do you
like,
exist?
how do you exist? It's like your arm's been amputated or your leg's not there. And then somebody's asking you, "Ki it's okay, you can just wear a mechanical leg and just run."
Right,
It doesn't
right,
happen like
right.
that.
Yeah, that's exactly even when in therapy, right? When people who have dealt with depression for a long period of time, and when I say depression, I'm talking clinical depression, right? They know that they should meditate and drink water and go for a jog. They are aware of these things, right? And that is why sometimes it saddens me as a person who has lived experience also with this condition. In fact, the reason I became a psychologist was because I dealt with depression as a teenager, you know, and severe clinical depression because of a variety of circumstances. But that is a very, very important part of the therapeutic discussion, that people say that we know that I should do this or I should do that and I should do that. But you have to understand, in order to do something, you must feel a sense of worth in yourself, you know, that I'm connected to something, you know. So that is why some of the most useful, I would say, help or recovery paths or treatment plans or whatever you might call it for depressive people who deal with depression or depressive spirals is community oriented, and it is based on what is called biofeedback, where your body and your mind are made to feel safe and connected
And validated, is
and
validation something
validated.
that is
Yes,
an important factor? So
yes,
when
yes.
we talking about validation, Scherezade, are we talking about internal validation in this case or external or both?
See, the thing with validation again is that just like depression and sadness, there is a lot of confusion about what the word validation means, right?
अप्रूवल
Um,
अप्रूवल नहीं होता है? वेल क्या होगा वैलिडेशन? व्हाट डू यू मीन? हाँ, गुड
validation
क्वेश्चन
would
एक्चुअली.
it would
व्हाट
be
इज वैलिडेशन?
support. Validation is support. I see you. It's being witnessed. That's what validation is, right? And I'll quickly, you know, help people understand this. Human beings are the only species where when a baby is born or comes into the world, it requires a lot of external support for a long time to exist, right? If a puppy is born, 15 days, opens its eyes, starts moving around. We have rescued puppies who were abandoned, didn't have a mother, survived, right? Human babies require external environmental support, right? So for us, our environment matters a lot, and that is the reason why validation matters. Because validation is not just someone asking for attention. Validation is a sort of signal that the environment and I are connected. Okay, when a baby starts crawling, and there are studies which will indicate this to be true, when a baby starts crawling, if there is someone standing at the end of the room encouraging it to walk, when babies start to learn how to walk, if there's encouragement and someone is like playing with them and encouraging them to come towards them, they learn to walk a little faster, you know. So that is also validation, that I see you, I encourage you, I support you, right? But I think somewhere the meaning of validation gets lost because on social media, validation is your likes and hearts and comments, right? But we do need that because it does inspire certain chemical reactions in the brain, which allow you to be more connected, right? It helps to be able to call a friend and talk to them. It helps when the friend says, I get you, I understand what's going on with you. Forget about direct validation, indirect validation. You're watching a show that resonates with you, where you feel like your circumstance has been shown. You feel validated by it, it's representation, you know. So human beings, because we are very oriented towards attachment, because we have almost this biological need to be supported by the environment, we require three essential components to exist well. We require safety, we require support, and we require soothing. All right, safety is protection, support is validation, soothing is regulation. These are the three pillars of your sense of existence in the world. And that's why validation matters.
If validation is something that matters, and if validation is something that is very natural to a human being, why is it that in today's time, validation, external validation has been demonized as well? I'll tell you where I'm coming from. When people generally do go through their bouts of sadness, when people generally do go through their life's ups and downs and struggles, what is the first thing that we do? We open YouTube. We try to listen to talks
Yeah.
which are motivating, that are uplifting. I'll go more deep into it. Now I'll segregate as a man what I do. As a man, I'm not going to search for motivational talks by a female. As a man, I'm going to search for motivational talk by a man. When you have this burst of information that is out there openly accessible to all, in today's time, for me, seeking external validation in my head is demonic. I'm like, Raghav, come on, you are less of a man if you're trying to seek an external validation. So Scherezade, why do you think this validation thing got such a bad rep? Is it just a marketing thing to get one side up? Or do they understand that people need to hear such things? I don't know, I'm confused. That's why validation in today's time, for me at least, has become something which has gotten a very, very bad reputation.
The first thing to realize is that any basic emotional state and an attempt to make it gendered is always rooted in some form of delusion, right? How can an emotional state be fixed by gendering it and saying if you're sad and you're a man, then you must behave like a man? Like, are there biological realities between sexes? Yes, but to transform that into some form of a gendered philosophy that you must do this and they must do, when a kid is born, when a baby is born, sorry, for how long is that baby not aware of their own sex?
Gender,
Or
yeah,
their,
for a very long time. Yeah,
right?
for a very
So
long time.
now, healthy parenting involves what? When that baby starts to crawl or starts to walk, at least healthy parenting doesn't differentiate whether the baby walking is a boy or a girl, right? So how do we get to a point where we talk about emotional experiences or behavioral experiences and try to gender it and say you should do it? The second thing is that there is obviously this fascination with obscurantism, obscure philosophies, and then using it and saying aisa karo, you know. So I think somewhere these movements emerge from loss of identity, loss of connection, right? Community building within, I would say, to some extent, women or those who are identified female at birth is almost innate. You know, women will talk to other women about their challenges. You know, women will form support groups. But as Terence Real, who is a psychologist, who's a researcher, he's researched masculinity pretty much for most of his career. And he wrote, I think he worked with Bell Hooks, who's a brilliant writer, who was a brilliant writer. And in one of their books that I think they have co-authored, or I think he's featured in the book, there is a wonderful line where he said that when he started researching masculinity, he thought that, you know, injury was an outcome of that form of socialization, right? That hypermasculinity meant that to socialize you would probably get injured. And then he said, after I researched it for several years, I realized no, it is the process. You have to be injured, right? So if you're already suffering, imagine you're suffering from, let's say, clinical depression, where you're already feeling lonely. The philosophy that is being packaged to you is that just be more lonely, just be more silent, just be more detached, just be strong. And the concept of strength is absolutely not defined, right? Strength, for instance, let's say, for I'm giving an example here, one of the strongest acts of human endurance is to give birth. Takes a village, should ideally take a village. The person who's giving birth should be surrounded by all the support in the world. So what is strength then, right? Why do we keep defining strength as some isolated, you know, brutally cleansing experience? Relational attachment to people around help. It doesn't mean that everybody needs to have 3,000 people looking after them, but connection matters. At the base of all our suffering is a lack of connection to purpose, to meaning. So
Absolutely agree. Yeah, that's really makes sense. You know, Scherezade, you just said at the base of all our suffering. Okay, I further want to go deep into clinical depression. Now, in your experience, in your vast 20 years of being a professional psychologist and a psychotherapist, you must have seen a lot of cases of people who were clinically depressed, men, women alike, right? I would want to understand the genesis of such mental health conditions. Okay. I want to understand that because you have seen such an array of people going through clinical depression, you sometimes must think and sit that I can understand where this is coming from. So I want to know, what is your analysis? What do you think in these cases when people do have clinical depressions? What are the root causes? Because in a conversation, you did mention about the environment. You did mention about the support system. And when you do say support system, the only thing that comes up to my mind is a family support system, because that is the first support system that we encounter in the life. And specifically, when you say the family support system, what comes into my mind is the nuclear versus a proper family, wherein you have everybody living in the same roof. You have that ecosystem of cousins, of family members and extended family members. So what I want to go deep, I want to understand what is your understanding of the root cause of clinical depression in people that you've seen.
it's a very complex experience, with anything related to our mind, our feelings, our behaviors. It's a very complex experience. So it's very hard to pin it down, because one of the biggest challenges when it comes to researching mental health, or for that matter, mental illness, is that you can't create a simulation. You cannot induce somebody. It will be unethical to induce that condition in someone and then try to treat it. You cannot have lab rats. you know. So you're trying to understand feelings, emotions in real time. So as an experience, when we talk about clinical depression, like I said earlier, that it is an affect or mood that has been disturbed. And depending on a variety of reasons, it can be rooted in certain familial experiences, family, your upbringing. I know it's a cliche for psychologists to say, tell me about your childhood, you know but childhood does shape people in some way, right? So it can originate there. It can be an outcome of repeated distress. Clinical depression is often an outcome of repeated distress, repeated disturbance to your ability to feel, think, and express. Okay, it is a sort of making your world small, shrinking you, right? When does depression happen? Depression, not just as a biological or a physical experience, but say, even if you look at land and it gets depressed, it starts to sink, a sinkhole, right? When does it happen? Right. So it's largely because the pressure is building over a period in time,
Yeah, yeah, unchecked.
unchecked, right? And you have just been told to brace for it, right? So for a lot of people who deal with clinical depression, they have felt that pressure build up over their childhood, over their teenage years. They've had distressing experiences or traumatic experiences in some cases, repeated. So their ability to trust, right, the three pillars that I talked about, right, protection, safety, validation, support, regulation, soothing, those three pillars are broken. You know, um, for very very extreme cases, all three pillars are broken. For some cases, one is broken, the other two are a little bit wonky. That's why I'm always cautious of not making people feel like being clinically depressed is just an individual problem. You know, being alienated as a child, living in social environments where you have felt excluded over and over again. Those are some of those root causes. Then, of course, there is that much debated and even more complicated space of biological or neurochemical reasons. You know, depression, according to some research studies, also has a genetic or a hereditary component. you know. So it is a variety of variables that are at interplay, you know. But from experience in therapy, I can assure that this is something that we also believe as psychologists, that there could be a biological predisposition towards it. But in order for it to manifest, your environment has caused enough stress and pressure.
It has poked it
It's poked it enough,
for it to come
right,
out
for it
and
to come out.
manifest.
Yes. And it think about it even from the concept of it being genetic, right? Like say a parent or a grandparent had it. It went unchecked, it went untreated. It would have had some repercussions. It would have affected the environment in that household in which then that child was being raised. So it's very hard to separate that it is hardcore only genetic and not environmental, because those things do occur. That's one of the first things, in fact, we would ask in an intake: do you have any history, family history of dealing with something like this? Not just with your immediate family, it could be an uncle, an aunt, a grandparent, anybody, you know. In India, for instance, and I talk about it in the book also, caste, right? When you live with realities of caste, um, and you watch your parents or your grandparents live with that, how do you not come out of it? Or how do you come out of it, rather, without feeling some form of turbulence and distress? When
Caste
you face
how?
those.
Sherazad, caste how? In what sense?
Say if you come from an oppressed caste or marginalized caste, right? And I have seen this in my own experience. I've seen this with friends. So people who, whose parents, for instance, I had a classmate for a very brief period in time, whose father was from a particular caste, and they were the cleaners, right? He was doing everything in his power to give his kid the best education possible, right? This girl was extremely bright, right? Not that it matters that you don't have to be bright to be treated well, but she was bright, and yet she would barely participate in the class, you know, and constantly be bullied, not just by the students but by the teachers, right? They'd make her sit at the back. Conversations about all kinds of negative slurs, right? I also came from a marginalized caste, and within the caste hierarchy, maybe not her level, but maybe one level above, but less than the rest. So we were hushed back to the back of the class, right? So when you live with that for say 10 years of your educational experience, for me it was not that 10 years because I moved between places. But imagine if that girl has to go through that for a repeated number of years. What is that going to do to her mind? You know, when we talk about safety, protection, support, validation, soothing, regulation, what does that do to the three pillars, fundamental pillars of her sense of self-worth, right? And then imagine that, let's say, if she loses her father in an accident, right? Or if at a later stage in her life she's in a relationship, and the person rejects her, which is also not uncommon in relationships. How does this narrative not add into that? you know then is it fair to say that this person is only individualized patient of depression? There's a history to it, you know that it affects people, right? I have friends who, I was sitting with a friend at a restaurant, belongs to a particular caste group, and was just going through their phone and started crying, on a quote unquote happy day. They're out for brunch, started crying. And so I sat with them, and they were just reading the news, and they were reading news about, you know, manual scavengers and people who were dying, cleaning the sewers, right? So this person who is celebrating something good that day just broke down. It is not something that is happening to them directly, but it is an extension of the reality that they have seen in their own lives. So it's a shadow that stays with you. So these are also lived realities which affect a person's mental health. They don't go away. You know, when you read about it, when you watch videos of it, you know, coming from Bihar, when you read or when you watch a video where a boy basically gets a thela to carry his dead mother, because nobody in the village is willing to cremate her because of her caste. Can you imagine what goes on with that boy's psyche? You know, then to say that this is just a biological thing, this is just an illness, like no amount of meditation in the world alters that reality.
And it will stay with you. It will haunt you for a
Yeah,
very long time.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think sometimes practices like meditations, they just fire back.
In fact, with a lot of people who have post-traumatic stress or trauma, like very strong experiences of trauma, meditation can be very counterproductive. It can be
Absolutely.
very, very counterintuitive. It can really be very, very triggering.
Yes.
And that's why a lot of times when people force themselves to sit in certain forms of meditation, not all forms of meditation, but certain forms of meditation, like particularly silent meditations, can be very triggering for people who have histories of post-traumatic stress.
Absolutely.
You know, that's why I'm also very cautious when people fire random pieces of advice.
Now that we have been talking about clinical depression, is that a lot of these factors are not in your control.
Yes,
How can
yes.
you control the caste you are born in? How can you control the kind of parents you have been bestowed with? How can you control the friends, the schools, the ecosystem, the cities? I'm just thinking about it, that how can you fix something that was not your fault to begin with?
Yeah.
Getting what I'm saying? How can you control something that was never in your power to control? And which brings me to the next thing, Scherezade. Now that we have understood what is clinical depression, now that we have kind of understood the genesis of it, that there are multiple factors which are involved, we have also understood the misinformation that is out there. I want to talk a little bit about the hope. So, what are the chances of somebody coming to you with the severity of him or her having clinically been depressed since many a years, of you being able to help him or her properly and seeing positive impacts?
You know, good therapeutic interventions, right, or good therapy, if I was to make it very simple, is a relationship more than what you're offering in terms of knowledge and resources, which obviously are a part of it. It is a safe relationship. You know, you're talking to somebody who is going to be non-judgmental or unbiased, who is willing to receive you, right? That for a lot of people is the first time they've experienced a safe relationship. There are a lot of people who when they sit in a therapeutic interaction, for the first time they understand what is a safe relationship with another human being, which is not built on any kind of conditional acceptance. You know, and that is probably the most powerful part of therapy, that it is this space that you co-create with somebody who is not accepting you with conditions, right? You could be married to somebody who loves you a lot, but might have their own thoughts about your depression. So there is a level of condition there. And it's not their fault, it's because they don't know what to do with it, right? When you come to therapy, you get somebody who's trained, right? But is also an empathetic witness to that process and is willing to commit to that with you, right? So that relationship is probably the strongest aspect of a therapeutic interaction, which I think is often under discussed, because people always talk about methods and techniques and tips. It is that sense of trust. Trust is the most vital of emotions, and it is also the most ignored of all experiences, right? So when you are able to build trust, human beings are extremely industrious. We are extremely industrious. We are very capable of healing ourselves, right? I mean, human beings can build the most amazing monuments, and human beings can also be like Dasrat Manji, who can cut up a mountain because he decided, right? A traumatized man, right? Traumatized on several levels, loss of a loved one, poverty, you know, but cut open a mountain. So human beings have what it takes to heal, but they need that safety. They need that sense of unconditional regard. That's the official therapeutic term that we use. I practice existential psychotherapy because I'm very, I value it and I have been affected by it personally, right? So that is the first part. So that helps a lot. I've had people who have come in and who are struggling to be seen in their lives, right? Quote unquote productive people, good parents, good mother, good father, and still struggles with a mental health condition because they're always performing a role. You come to a therapeutic environment, you no longer have to perform a role, right? So you can unburden yourself and you can sit, right? Even as a psychologist, I am not one of those people who thinks that therapy is the be all end all of all healing. I think it is a starting point. It helps or encourages you to find out what will work for you, what will not. It gives you comfort, it gives you courage. Then, of course, there is the trained scientific knowledge of what you can actually help a person with, what you can identify. So many people will come in because they think they are depressed. But when you work with them, you realize you're not depressed. You have, let's say, ADHD, and you've been struggling with that. And the depression you're experiencing is a reaction of constantly masking your ADHD in front of everybody else. You're not going to meet your friends, and you think you're depressed. No, that's because when you go to meet your friends, you don't feel like you fit in, so you don't go, and because you don't go, you feel isolated and depressed. So this is the scientific knowledge based expertise, you know and in terms of examples, I mean, I am an example of it. I came from a very difficult family background. I dealt with a very, very turbulent and distressing childhood, and I struggled with finding the right kind of help. And I completely identify with people who struggle with finding the right kind of help. There is a lot of unfortunate, unacknowledged harm that also occurs because of psychiatric and mental health institutions, right? But it's a trial and error sort of a process. And I found the communities, the people, the format of therapy that worked for me, right? Does it get better? Yes. It gets better, right? The goal of therapy is not to fix your life, it is to free your life. It is not to fix your life.
Oh, that's very deep and profound. Yeah.
Yeah. When you are free, it doesn't mean that negative experiences will not happen to you. It means that somewhere you have braced for it. You believe in your own potential. In terms of the social realities which cause mental health distress, like probably class or caste or gender, I think it is up to us to reframe and change how these social institutions work. And I'm very glad because I think the current generation, maybe my generation, we have put in some work into it. You know, it takes very little to make a difference, right? During COVID, to give you an example, during COVID, COVID was a very difficult period for most people, who work in mental health. I mean, people at large, of course, it was a terrible period, but in mental health, because people were lonely, people didn't have access to contact, there was doom and gloom. But somehow people found a way to build communities with each other. you know During COVID, I would go and talk to the security guards, right? And you don't realize how these worlds exist beyond yours, right? Because you're sitting and thinking about your world and your disconnection, and you go and talk to that guy, and the guy is like, I don't know when I will see my children next, right? And what can you offer? You can offer a conversation, you can offer food, you can offer care, you can check in, right? So when COVID stopped, I have done this. I've seen family members do this, so I do it often. But then I started telling people around me that please talk to people around you. It's not just people who are your peer group. Talk to everyone around you, because mental health today has also become a bit of a privileged conversation.
Yes.
You know that it is for this class of people, this group of people who talk about it and who are aware of it. Security guards, the person who sells vegetables, they're all people who require this help. But when you start engaging with them, it does benefit, it does help. So I have seen lots of examples of that. I have sat with people, and during COVID, all we have done in therapies that have been like, I'll be on a video call, you make your breakfast, we'll just do this today.
Oh, wow. They just wanted some presence to be there. Just the presence that they can see.
Yeah.
Some. Wow.
Yeah, we need that. When we were trained with like an iron rod that be a fly on the wall, and you have to be neutral all the time, which is true. But then human experience is not that black and white.
Yeah.
So I've seen people, I have had so many wonderful cases of people who came and they felt defeated. And they felt defeated for a long period in time. But they took little steps, small steps, you know, and they discovered that discovery was also beautiful because they thought that they had to do some sort of a big leap to feel valid. But they took small steps and they'll still message that I'm doing well. I'm happy. Or I'm doing well. It's not always stable, but I feel alive. And that's, I think that is the beauty of a good therapeutic relationship.
No, that is brilliant. I mean, what you said is just so profound. It makes so much sense. And I think when we were talking about this privilege thing, right? Sometimes I feel that those people who are not able to have these discussions, they are, even if they somewhere know that they are going through something which is near clinical, they have this other half of the mind which is saying that let's get our fundamentals right first. Maybe
Yes.
that will help us.
Yes.
Let's get the food on table first. Let's get some more money. Let's raise our statuses a bit. Maybe that can help us first before we try to bypass these things and go ahead. The basic fundamentals of life is something that they're struggling with, and that is why they're not able to have the conversations, because they feel that these essentials are what is causing problems with us, right?
Right. And it's interesting, right? Because your sanity should be an essential part of your life, right? Because everything else that you do, I sometimes talk to, if I take a cab, sometimes when the driver talks to me, I'll talk to them, and I become curious. So I ask. I said, "आप कभी गए हैं किसी के पास help?" Sorry, help lene. So the language is not the same as maybe the language of privilege in urban environments, but when people are dealing with distress, they know something is off. So I remember this guy. He said, हमारी ना ऐसा लगता है हमारी छाती पे पत्थर रख दिया है. हमको आजकल बहुत लगता है छाती पे पत्थर रख दिया है. पहले नहीं होता था, अब होता है. And so I said, कब से आपको होता है? Since when have you been feeling this? So he said, हमारा तो कोविड में सब चला गया था because I was driving a cab and then I lost everything. So अभी भी कभी हम न्यूज़ पढ़ते हैं ना, तो हमको ऐसा कुछ हमने पढ़ लिया. So he read some news about the in Pune recently there were a lot of cases of a particular illness, right? And there was a reason for it.
Yes. No.
Right? So Julian Barita. So he read that, and then he said, हमको ऐसा धक-धक feel हो रहा था. Because that's trauma, because he thought that maybe something is starting again and again I have to go
and it's going to repeat.
Yes, and he will lose his livelihood and whatnot. So I said आप किसी आपने कभी help कहीं पे आपको लिया है आपने? So for him it is hard to compute when will he go.
Absolutely.
When will he go?
So Scherezade, what we'll do next now? So there are a lot of these illnesses and diseases and conditions which are a part of this mental health ecosystem, right? And you have explained a lot of them in your book with incidents, and you have related with your own life with wherever it is applicable, and also given cases of how things happened with specific clients and people. Now, there are 3-4 illnesses or diseases that I would want you to briefly touch upon. We'll not go a lot deep into it, but I still want people to understand what they are, what are the symptoms, and I also would want to understand that how can one person understand that she or he is going through these symptoms, that they can at least find the right help. How do you decide that? How do you, when you should, right? So that's the entire arc that I want to cover now. Of these illnesses and diseases, I want you to focus on 4, which I found very important, and please feel free to add if you want to add more. One is this schizophrenia. I find it very difficult to pronounce it. You have even mentioned in a book that Indians find it very difficult to pronounce it. Then I want to talk about OCD, because OCD is not simply OCD. There is another vertical to OCD. Then I want to talk about bipolar disorder and autoimmune disorder. I had no idea that autoimmune would be a part of this ecosystem. I thought this is just a physical health condition when your entire system goes against you, right? So schizophrenia, OCD, BPD, and autoimmune disorder. Let's start with schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia is categorized in the DSM as a severe mental illness. Of course, like I said before, also that there will always be conflicts and debates around this, because there are people who with lived experience of schizophrenia who feel that constant classification as an illness reduces their agency. That they feel that we also have a we also have an experience of reality, and constantly telling us that we are just mentally unwell doesn't take into account that maybe our brains function differently, right? So, for the purpose of our conversation, I'm taking a more clinical approach to it, while
Yes.
acknowledging that lived experience also matters a
Yeah.
lot, right? Schizophrenia is unfortunately probably the most inaccurately represented mental health condition in popular culture. And in fact, most of early understanding of mental health through pop culture came through bad portrayals of schizophrenia. You
For
know,
example.
for example, let's say take any horror film,
Mm.
right? Exorcism of Emily Rose,
Mm.
right? There is a constant insinuation in those environments that this person's mind is split. Schizophrenia
Yeah.
quite literally means the splitting of your mind. You
Splitting
know,
of your mind, as in
yes.
you are splitting of your mind, not, I'm guessing, verbatim, but
No, so it's not the splitting of your brain; it's your mind, the invisible part of your brain, the functioning or the cognition, the perception of your brain. It has split. In most of our cases, right? Let's say that we are what we would call neurotypical people. Neurotypical people are people with a standardized brain function that works in tandem with what we know the human brain's capabilities to be. So in neurotypical people, there's an integration of certain brain functions, right? In schizophrenia, there is a splitting, right? So if you look at, I don't remember the name right now, but for instance, there was an artist, very well-known artist, who was diagnosed with it, then started documenting the change in his artwork as his schizophrenia progressed. So from making these beautiful, very precise human portraits to making the most on LSD sort of hallucinogenic sort of without being on them artwork, his brain started to see things very differently, right? From a clinical perspective, schizophrenia is very misunderstood within mental health care and also with the larger population, right? People who deal with schizophrenia are some of the, I would say, the most emotionally aware people I've met. But you would not know that if you saw pop culture portrayals, because it always portrays schizophrenia as this person who is hearing sounds, who's seeing things all the time, right? So the one thing I always tell people is that any mental health condition, particularly severe mental illnesses, they exist on a spectrum. Not every person with that condition experiences it the same way. There could be milder versions of it that people experience, and there could be more intense versions of it. You know, some of the components of schizophrenia tend to be particularly of one type of schizophrenia, which is called paranoid schizophrenia. Uh, there tends to be hallucinations, auditory hallucination. You hear sounds, you hear somebody talking to you, you know, or there are visual hallucinations, you know. And again, these are not people who are living in some far off place. These are people like you and me who have a job, who have families, who go to work, you know. So when it comes to schizophrenia, I feel like the portrayal has been so inaccurate that it has created unnecessary uh, stigma around it. It is treatable, it is manageable. I wouldn't say treatable, I would say it's manageable, because after its onset you can't go back and undo it.
okay, so
You
this is
have to learn
something
to,
which you can't undo at all.
yeah, you have to live with it, you have to manage it. And people who live with schizophrenia based on psychiatric treatment, based on therapeutic treatment, based on other interventions, have regular lives, families, jobs and whatnot. Often in schizophrenia, and this is again a very big debate, for some people medication has been the lifesaver. But for some people, medicine or medication has also called what is called iatrogenic harm, which is psychiatric harm, unintentional medical abuse. So there it's a bit split, right? Because schizophrenia symptoms to a to a lay person can feel threatening because of the conditioning.
You
Because you're
feel
getting
as if there's somebody who's threatening you. Is that the kind of
no,
visions
you
that?
feel like, it's the image of being told that this person looks possessed. That's what I've heard a lot, right? When I talk to family members, that they look possessed because the person suddenly starts to hear sounds, right? They're sitting and they start hearing sounds, or they start seeing, somebody is moving around the room that can't see, I can't see, and they're talking to that person, right? So we obviously, the amount of taboo around it, that image of that person who's actually dealing with a mental health condition looks fear-inducing to the person who doesn't understand that condition.
Yeah.
So therefore, people with schizophrenia often also deal with a lot of harm. You know, there has been a lot of what is called rights-based activism to help change this perception, right? Uh, Rights-based approach in mental health is to look at mental health care, or largely health care, from the perspective of rights of patients, clients, or those who seek that help, right? So schizophrenia, I think, is probably the most visible form of mental illness in
Yeah.
our society, right? That's the one thing that we immediately think of.
That is closest to somebody calling you insane or insanity.
Yes, yes, right. It is also, it's manageable. There is help available, but because it has been demonized so much in public perception that people get afraid of it around them before they even understand it. The biggest irony is that people who suffer from extreme mental illness, they are more likely to be harmed than cause any. So even if that experience that this person is going through might be unsettling for you know, it doesn't help to vilify it.
If somebody is going through schizophrenia,
Mhm.
will that individual be in that position to understand his condition and then take actions on his own? Or in this case, is it very important for the support system to identify and then help that individual? Is what I want to understand. Does it affect your decision making capabilities? Is what I'm trying to also understand. How, that's what I want to know, that how can somebody realize it by its own and then seek out help, is what I want to know.
See, with schizophrenia, the individual assessment for a person, it's very hard compared to, say, if you're dealing with clinical depression.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I.
Because let's say if a person is dealing with paranoid schizophrenia and they start to experience hallucinations, they cannot differentiate. That is the whole point
So
of
they
it being
cannot
characterized.
because for them you are saying that hallucinations is their reality. It's their
Yes, that's their
reality.
reality.
So
It's their
obviously,
reality.
if that is their reality, then there is not anything unnatural about it in their
Yes.
mind. It's
Yeah.
like, this is natural. This is what it is. I can
Yes.
see somebody.
It's very integrated, or it gets very integrated in their understanding, right? So they will not actively seek help, right? Like when you mentioned that, I think when I look back that I probably was going through an anxiety attack or something of that sort. There's a part of you that recognizes that something that you were experiencing was turbulent.
Yeah.
But for instance, if I've had clients sit with me in the clinic or in the waiting area, they will talk. Again, like I said, the representation is almost always exaggerated about these conditions. They talk to you. They will sit with me, and they're talking to me, and we're doing an intake where we ask basic questions, and they'll pause, and then they will turn around and they will talk to somebody, right? So to that person, that is also part of their reality. And that is why we have to create some form of a net, like a catching net, that there should be people around them.
Next, let's go to OCD. What is OCD? And again, I'll tell you certain things about OCD that I know. Everything about OCD that I know, again, I think this is one thing which is very loosely used, just like depression. People use, okay, I'm depressed. In today's time, OCD is not taken seriously at all. I can tell my friends, "Kya yaar, tere ko to OCD hai, pagal hai kya?" I'm just saying that this has lost its relevance, which is very sad. Any illness or disease should not lose its relevance. So I want to clear some myths around OCD as well. What is OCD? There are multiple things in OCD as well, which is written in the book. So let's get deep dive into OCD, the symptoms, and the terminology, what happens, the diagnosis if possible, how is it something which is even reversible or non-reversible or treatable XYZ. Let's go into it.
See, I think, to address that question about pop culture creating myths about OCD, right? I feel, and this is somewhat of a controversial opinion, but I think it to be somewhat true also, is that there are certain mental health conditions that have been presented or rather glamorized in popular culture, even though they are painful, right? Like the whole tortured artist, which on some level glamorizes a certain kind of depression, right? That the genius.
Yeah, it's in the Rockstar. I remember कि तेरा दुख नहीं है तो गाना नहीं निकलेगा. I remember
Right,
that movie when he
right,
wants to break up
right,
with a girl
right,
so that he can go through that
right,
that pain.
right, right. So I think art as a writer or or even as an artist of some sort, I do understand the need to tap into emotions, and obviously negative emotions can be more potent fuel. But at the same time, I feel that certain conditions are glamorized and certain conditions are not spoken about at all because they don't have that sort of dramatic quotient for people to interpret, right? So OCD is one of those conditions. And again, popular culture. Lots of movies would portray these quirky geniuses. Monk was a
I
detective
remember,
show,
yeah.
right?
He's very
And
that doesn't even touch, always keeps his
right, right.
distance. Yeah.
So you will notice a common trope that the OCD characters are also extremely intelligent,
Yes.
right?
Something similar to when they used to showcase bisexual characters.
Right,
That
right.
if somebody's gay, I mean, it's given if you're gay, you are intelligent.
Or you're at least, they're tropes, right? That when they would introduce a certain kind of, like, maybe early on when gay men were introduced, they were always flamboyant,
Yes, they're very
right?
sophisticated. They were very cultured.
Yes. So what happens with tropes is that it shrinks the reality of that experience. It is
Absolutely.
not to say that there are not people who have OCD who might be like that. It is to say that it's a very wide range, and you're shrinking it and minimizing the experiences of other people who live with it, right? Obsessive compulsive disorders, that's what OCD is, right? That you deal with two dimensions. You deal with obsessive behaviors and or obsessive thinking, and you deal with compulsive behaviors which are often aligned or in reaction to the obsessive thinking, right? It's almost like your mind is always instructing you to do certain things and you can't say no, right? It used to be classified under anxiety, it used to be considered, and some practitioners or some people in the field still consider it to be an extension of anxiety, because that's what OCD is. It makes you perform the ritual because you're anxious that if you don't perform the ritual, something will happen which will not be good. The person who's washing their hands 20 times is doing so because, not because they don't know what they're doing, right? But the anxiety of not doing it is much higher for them, right? OCD is also, like you said, one of those labels that is used willy nilly. You know? But I also feel that a lot of times people label themselves in a certain way because they are actually struggling with something and they don't know where to park it. So they pick something close by, right? And like I said, that there is this sort of glamorization of certain things, right? That if I say I'm OCD, the interpretation is I'm organized. Whereas I have dealt with, or I have worked with, or I have witnessed a lot of people with OCD, they're not organized all the time, right? It starts with obsessive thinking. That's what it is. And it's a very difficult state to be in. You know, it's people who deal with very extreme forms of OCD who cannot get into a train or a bus, cannot get into a building, right? Cannot read a book, right? Because I have to read a book, then I have to skip every fifth page. If I don't skip the fifth page, then there's a problem, right? Skin on the hand peels because of the number of times that they wash their hands. Face peels, you know. Sometimes the progress in therapy is to see that the person's skin is getting better, right? Because they wash their face so many times or they use so much alcohol scrub. So It is not as simple as I like to put things together, I have OCD, and people have to be a bit cautious of using it like that, right? OCD can further have three separate classifications. There are people who are on the milder side of it, which we say high insight, that I know that I tend to perform a compulsive action, but there is some reason and I'm not able to stop it, but I minimize it. Then there are people with low insight, more compulsive actions, more obsessive thoughts. And then there are people who have no insight, the the heightened OCD, that I have to do this. If I don't do this, life will just crash.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is very definitely a clinical category. It is not a placeholder for just a quirk or a habit or a character trait. And people should take it seriously. Because when we throw the labels around willy-nilly, right? Imagine the person who's sitting at the table that you don't know, who actually deals with a very severe version of that. In fact, the people who deal with it often feel some sense of shame in disclosing it.
Yep.
So it is so harsh for that person to sit there and think, I suffer from this, I struggle with this, and I'm not able to disclose. And here, three people are throwing it around
Yep.
like it is some sort of, a badge.
As it's a code that they have cracked based on my life, which I haven't figured out.
Yeah.
It's insulting.
I'm saying that there is acceptance for that, and I have struggled with acceptance for so many years, and I'm not able to state this because of whatever reasons. And you are throwing it around as if it's a badge of honor.
Is this something which is curable, reversible? What is it? Do you something you live with it, or is there definitely some cure that can happen in the longer run with the proper help and support?
I think cure is also, I sometimes feel like, what does cure mean? Because largely you have to live with most of your conditions, right? Yeah. So it is manageable.
Manageable. Yeah, that's the right word. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it's manageable. You can get the help you need. Most people have perfectly functional lives with OCD if they get the right kind of help.
But is there a case wherein the level of OCD is so severe that that it might be somewhat manageable but still not completely? I just want to understand the extent of the severity of this thing.
Yeah,
what it can do to an individual.
Yeah, there could be cases, there could be variations that can be very strong, because in those cases what we also see is coexistence of other conditions. So they also have a history of very, very acute trauma. And the OCD that they have developed has been developed as some sort of a maladapted defense against the trauma. So in that case, you have to treat the trauma also. If it goes untreated, then you can't manage the OCD, right? So it's manageable, but it requires care, effort, patience.
Yeah. Next, Scherezade, let's go to BPD. Again, BPD. I have heard BPD like BPD. BPD है, अरे वो पता है वो बंदा जो है वो उसको वो है यार वो BPD है वो. And I'm like, I had to first Google what is BPD, and it came bipolar disorder. And I still don't know what is bipolar. I don't know what is bipolar disorder. I do understand what is bipolarity, but I want to know what is bipolar disorder. What are the symptoms of somebody who's a bipolar, and how can it impact an individual's life on a daily basis if somebody is a BPD? And then again, how can it be managed with proper help and support?
BPD actually is not bipolar disorder. BPD stands for Borderline Personality Disorder, which is a different condition.
Okay, so you're saying bipolar disorder is different and borderline personality disorder is different. So let's which one do you want to start off with then?
See, since you mentioned BPD, I will clarify BPD, which is borderline personality.
Let's do that. Yeah.
Right? So borderline personality is different. And just to give you context for bipolarity, right? Bipolar is a part of that spectrum that I was earlier talking about affect depression, right? I said unipolar depression is... So unipolar depression means you only experience lows. Bipolar depression, which is the right term for it, means that you experience lows and you experience highs without being able to regulate either one of them.
And how often does the switch happen? Is there a switch that happens, or is it? I don't think it can happen simultaneously, but I just want to understand how can it switch? That it could be that you are happy and suddenly it crashes. So just want to know.
Yes, that happens. There are two types of bipolar condition: bipolar 1, bipolar bipolar 2. In one, there are largely depressive episodes, which are punctuated by a few what are called manic or heightened mood episodes. And then there is, you know, on and off, on and off. I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm happy, I'm sad. Not happy or sad, I think that would be a minimization, but I would say I'm high, I'm excited, I'm low. I'm excited, I'm low, right? So bipolarity is a part of the depression conversation. You know, it's a type of depression, right? It is the, I would say, the sibling of clinical depression, right? Borderline personality is a personality disorder. It is not related necessarily to the affect or the mood disorder category. It is a separate category, a separate classification.
Borderline personality. So BPD basically is borderline
Yeah.
personality disorder.
So, borderline personality essentially would be part of the personality spectrum or conditions which are related more to personality based difficulties, dysfunctions. They are largely going to impact your relationships, your
Can you give me
social
some?
interactions.
Can, can you first give me some example? I'm still not able to understand. Like,
Mhm.
give me an example that if let's say XYZ
Mhm.
is having a particular state of mind, then this could be.
Right.
Uh,
So the difference here would be, say, something like the different kinds of personality disorders. If you
ठीक है.
understand personality disorders, you will understand borderline. Say narcissistic personality, right?
Yeah, this one
That's a
I've heard.
personality-based condition.
Yeah.
Yeah. So narcissistic personality disorder. We might look at a certain global politician in some other country and say this person has a narcissistic personality,
And what do
right?
you mean when you
So
say narcissistic personality? Somebody who thinks very highly of herself or himself?
somebody who who is constantly cycling between extreme grandiosity that I am the biggest and the best, but also feels constantly victimized. It's a contradictory state of mind that
Wow.
I think I'm the best, but I'm also the most victimized, right? I am the greatest person who's ever lived, but I'm also the most victimized person, which is almost like a contradiction. Imagine living in that state where you think you are that great and you're that wonderful and you're that, but also simultaneously feeling that I'm never get given my due. I'm also treated badly. I'm also the victim largely. So that is basically the definition of a narcissistic personality disorder, which is different from narcissism, which is a behavioral trait, which is rooted in a bit of I-centered thinking, right? That I, me, myself. And I'm clarifying this because I think sometimes the word narcissism is also thrown around a lot.
Absolutely. 100%, specifically on YouTube, when it comes to relationships.
Yeah. So there is a lot of truth to the fact that there is narcissistic abuse. There are narcissistic personality challenges. There is narcissistic personality disorder. So, a personality disorder may or may not have some form of what is called a psychosomatic element to it. Depression is definitely psychosomatic, right? When you go through prolonged periods of clinical depression, your body takes a hit
Yeah.
also.
Yeah. Yeah.
Personality disorders are largely rooted in struggles, challenges, distress and turbulence related to your relationships. They are largely, it's not you individually that is inherently always suffering, which is the case, let's say, with anxiety. You feel that anxiety deep within yourself. But somebody with a narcissistic personality disorder may not feel that there's anything wrong with them or that anything is off in their way of being, right? So similarly, you have histrionic personality, you have a set of personality conditions, you know, um, and then like we spoke about OCD, there is a version of OCD in the personality segment also, which is called OCPD, which is
Yeah.
a milder
OCPD.
version of OCD, right? And within that group or that cluster, you have borderline personality, which is primarily this constant sort of tug of war, emotional tug of war, that affects your ability to build and sustain relationships. And
Build and sustain relationships, your
yeah,
inability
and
to.
yeah, constant, I would say, deficit, experience of deficit in relationships, constantly experiencing challenges, problems in relationships, not being able to maintain them.
And it's all internal. It's all internally happening. It's not always because of the external reasons.
No, it is external. In personality disorders, it is external. You are actually experiencing that because your mind is telling you, or not even your mind, your behavioral patterns are such, right? So, for instance, you get like very attached to somebody and you make them the center of your world. And then they don't answer your phone call and your whole world crashes. Yeah, that would be an example of it. You know, you break up with somebody, right? Obviously, you go through heartbreak, you go through pain. And I'm not talking about some sort of a violent breakup. I'm talking, yes, it did not work out, we are separated. And then you're just not able to stop messaging them. You're not for months on end, right? So it's this sort of turbulence and distress in relationships, and your sort of difficult, experiences managing your emotions, particularly negative emotions, you know, and it can be very difficult because it can feel very hopeless, right? Because say you deal with, say I live with clinical depression. Because I have some people in my life who are supportive, it helps. But when the root of your problem is that you're not able to build relationships, then it is even more difficult.
Yeah.
So this is again BPD. I wish there was more information which was helpful rather than stigmatizing. Because when you Google borderline personality, you get such castigating, demonizing information about the condition, right? That it can be very heartbreaking, right? But again, it is manageable, it is treatable, people live with it. It is hard, it is not to say it's not hard, but one of the most beautiful examples of lived experience helping the therapeutic community comes from BPD, because the format of therapy that works really well for BPD is called dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT.
Okay.
And it was developed by a practitioner who has lived with BPD. And living with BPD led her to developing this format of therapy, which works the best. So it's a very good example of somebody who was a practitioner who had lived experience and said, you know what, I'm going to figure out what works and help people. And it works. So it's a very hopeful case also.
So it's a hopeful case, something that can easily be, and a lot of research has gone into it already. Since we are talking about masking also, and we are also talking about it's not easy, I want to discuss with you a psychological phenomena, Scherezade. And really help me understand this thing, because I have gone through this thing in my own personal life. Why is it very difficult for men to express their emotions? Why is it very difficult for men to even accept that they are vulnerable to, let's say, depression, to, let's say, any of these symptoms? And more importantly, why is it very difficult for men even to cry in public? I'll give you. For me, when I was looking for a therapist, as I've told you over phone as well, to even Google was difficult. To even convince myself that I need help was difficult. To even convince myself that it's okay, nobody's going to know. And if nobody's going to know what you're doing, nobody's going to question your manhood.
Right, right.
That if nobody is going to know what you're doing, where you're going, nobody's going to question your manhood, so might as well let's go for it. That's how I convince myself. कि किसी को पता थोड़ा चल रहा है कि तू ऐसा कर रहा है कि तू थेरेपिस्ट के पास जा रहा है. I think after this episode, everybody will come to know that I went to the therapist.
That might just be, that will be helpful.
That will be helpful.
That will be helpful. That
So-
people look at somebody and say, okay.
Yeah,
yes,
so
because-
I want to know that why is the conditioning like that? And I also want to, and I deliberately want to give two examples of movies like Animal and Kabir Singh as well. A, it is difficult for men to express their emotionality and seek help. And B, because we feel that we are not men enough. Because in the way movies have portrayed men, it's like you have this beard, you have this chiseled lean body, you have a long hair, you can beat anyone if your girl is feeling threatened. And in my head, people call it toxic masculinity, but for me it is masculinity. Okay, so I feel okay, this is what a girl wants. A girl will only be attracted towards me if I do not show my weak side. If I'm always stoic, if I'm always a man. And I have seen that in movies many a times that a girl wants to fight with the man, wants the toxic side of him to come up. In today's time, Scherezade, I have been hearing this thing again and again that being a nice guy is bad. I remember because in your book, not the foreword, but Varun Grover has said something amazing about the book, right? So I was looking at an episode, some on YouTube, some episode, and one actor, a roundtable conference, and one actor was like, "Yeah, I have heard that being nice is not good. Being nice is being a nice guy is a very safe guy. Nobody wants a safe guy." Varun Grover was like, "Dude, the opposite of safe is not safe."
Right. Right.
So you were trying to say that girls need people who are not safe.
Yeah.
And he was just trying to say something which is a common notion that girls like bad boys. That girls like men who are like Ranbir Kapoor, who are like Shahid Kapoor as portrayed. And that is why I feel that men are not able to express themselves. And that if they keep it within themselves for a long time, it can culminate into something deeper, something chronic. Something that might be too late to diagnose and too late to help. So I want your help in understanding this psychology as well, both from the perspective of women, that why there is this notion that girls want bad guys and toxic masculinity and relationships in which the man is aggressive and yet loving as well, and why do men have this this need to hide their emotions and not express themselves. Just want to understand the psychology of this thing. Where is it coming from?
See, I don't think there's a lot of truth to either of these ideas, right? Because whatever a person is taught to desire, whether it's whatever the gender is of that person, is a form of socialization, right? What you are taught to desire is very relevant within the culture that you have been raised, right? What, let's say, what an 18 or a 19-year-old kid or a teenager, right, will find cool in India will be very different from what that 18 or 19-year-old will find is cool in, say, if they are in South Korea, or what they will find cool if they are in the United States, right? So our experiences are shaped by the cultures in which we are socialized. The challenge here is that when we talk about masculinity, or let's say we talk about this idea, like you said, that the actor said that nobody likes nice guys, it originates from very random, arbitrary places, and without any verification, it becomes a standard way of
Yes.
that I told you, you told me that, there is this old story like in anthropology that there's a tribe in which there's a wedding that is happening, and the girl who's getting married, she goes to the back of the house and she sees that her future mother-in-law, she has a basket, jute basket, and she puts it over a cat. So this woman sees that, and then when she gets married, she goes into that house. She has her own son, and when her son is getting married, she tells her husband that please get a cat and please get a jute basket because we need to perform the ritual that I saw. So the mother-in-law says there's no ritual. That cat was jumping on everything. So I was trying to cover her with a jute basket. So we see things and we interpret them in our own way, and we think that is what works. This is again a form of socialization. The challenge here is that desire, whether it's whatever gender you choose, the idea that desire has to be rooted in damage, that is the problem. For something or someone to be desirable, they must damage something, or they must be damaged for me to find them desirable.
Yeah.
Right? That is why the idea that whole quote by Terence Real, that injury is the way we socialize young boys to become men, to the point that it's glamorized when the man has an injury on the face, right? Masculine injury.
Yes.
Right. So there maybe have been a point in time where there were cultures, there were tribal cultures that somebody would go into the rite of passage would be to go into the jungle and hunt and whatever. But that rite of passage was not to make it attractive to that particular to the girl. The rite of passage was for that boy to go through those experiences.
It was an individual journey, not a social Hunting.
And a group journey, because 15
Group
boys
journey.
would be sent on that sojourn of sorts, right? So they would have to learn to coexist and collaborate, and those things disappeared, and it got rooted in perhaps this idea that
Of mating. Yeah.
of purely of mating, that the guy who comes back with the bear's
Yes.
skin
Skin.
is going
Yeah.
to be the. Now, I'm
Alpha.
not saying it's completely untrue that there has been some change in how people perceive this, or that pop culture obviously makes references to it. But the challenge is that if desire is rooted in damage, then these tropes will be true. But you see repercussions today, right? You see repercussions of the case that has happened in Orissa with that young girl's unfortunate demise. You know, that is
Nepali
the
girl,
problem.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that is the problem of
Yes.
socializing people like this, that making anybody feel that if somebody mistreats you, that is just a sign of, you know, their possessiveness. I think at the root of it is this belief that is being engendered for all of us, that passion and chaos are the same thing. They're the same thing. You interpret it like this, and if they are passionate about you, they'll make your life chaotic.
Yeah.
Whereas actual affection, desire, playfulness, intimacy is rooted in a level of attraction, but it is not chaotic.
Scherezade, now let's come to the last part wherein I now want to understand. So I'll tell you what I want to understand from you. I have been an entrepreneur in the tech industry. I have had startups. I've been in Gurgaon. So I do understand the space. I know that in India, the startup ecosystem is very mature. You have a lot of VCs, you have a lot of investors, you have the government who did Startup India, Stand Up India, really push the entire ecosystem. It was a national wave like ये स्वच्छ भारत अभियान. उस लेवल की अवेयरनेस फैलाई गई थी गवर्नमेंट के थ्रू भी, प्राइवेट सेक्टर्स में भी, इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर में भी, people who were participating, people who were creating startups. So very mature. India is a very mature ecosystem when it comes to startup ecosystem. Okay. We're in the top 5 countries in the world with the number of unicorns that we have. That is valuation of which is more than $1 million. So being in this ecosystem, I know this is a fairly mature ecosystem. The YouTube ecosystem is fairly mature. You have been a psychologist, a practicing psychologist for 20 years in India. I want to understand what have been your key takeaways of this sector in India. How mature is this thing? What more do you want to happen in this country, be it from the government side, be it from the people side, be it from the awareness side? So I want to understand all the positive and negatives and your own learning as being a practicing psychologist for 20 years in India. What needs to be done? What is already there? What more could be done? How do you feel this ecosystem should mature more? And where is this country right now in terms of this ecosystem? Want to really understand this thing.
So, there are three aspects to it. One is the structure of the mental health care system within the country, right, which will be divided between government and private sector, right. Largely, a lot of government intervention would be necessary, right, because the private sector within mental health care is almost always going to be very expensive, right. There's a hefty cost attached to it, and I say this as a private practitioner because sustaining your own private practice has a lot of costs attached to it, simply because training yourself in this field is expensive. So the challenge is not just clinical care or mental health care. The challenge starts with the right kind of programs training psychologists and psychotherapists, right. We don't have enough of that. We don't have enough educational programs uh, which are easily accessible to students, right, in all the states of this country, which train the right number, or at least close to the right number of practitioners who will be necessary given the population of this country. We have one of the highest global disease burden as per the WHO for clinical depression. But I don't remember the statistics exactly right now.
Which is
but
more than AIDS and something you mentioned.
Yeah,
It was more than
yeah.
that, 2.5
Combined.
million, something like that.
Yeah.
If I remember.
And so, how many practitioners do we have? We have like 0.03 psychologists per 100,000 people or so, right? So, we need to first create a bank of professionals, who can be available to people, right? Because, like you said, it's always word of mouth. You know somebody who recommends somebody, or you go on Google and you ad hoc figure something out, right? There's no structure to it. So we need that. We need better training, better education, and also better payment for people who work within government
Yes.
spaces when it comes to mental health care, because you cannot exist on the kind of salaries that most of them make. So they go into private sector. Number of people who have studied psychology and then become HR professionals, the data on that will be astounding, because they get paid. There's no inclination to then continue within the system that you were actually trained to be a part of. So that's one part of it. The second is, I think, because India is a country that has such a huge workforce in urban areas, workplace policy making around mental health is very important. Again, has to be aided by the government to some extent. That you should have very definitive workplace policies around mental health. People still get shamed for disclosure. People still get rejected from promotions if they so much as mention it once. You know, so that stigma, that taboo. While there is obviously a lot of outreach that matters, but sometimes you need the carrot and the stick approach. You do need policies which almost make it difficult for people to create stigma against people who deal with something difficult. That's the second part of it. I think some organizations are trying it, some are in the throes of it. I think sometimes the difference between mental health and mental wellness, the gap is very wide, because people think
Yes.
mental wellness, Zumba kara lo, ye kara lo, wo kara lo, ho gaya. We are talking about leave policies, we're talking about on-site therapists who are available, and somewhere that conversation that, this is very soft. हमारा generation जैसा नहीं था. It's nonsense.
Absolutely. Yeah.
तुम्हारा जनरेशन नहीं था, इसलिए उसके बाद का जनरेशन सफर कर रहा है.
Absolutely. Yeah, because they took it very lightly, and that is why. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we do need very specific approaches, and I have worked with organizations that do this, and you see the difference. You see the difference in what the workforce feels and how they participate. You have to be mindful, right? It cannot be a comedy of errors that you hold a mental health outreach program on a Saturday evening after you've called them for overtime. It doesn't make any sense. You need to have better policies around it. And I think somewhere we also need to decentralize it. We need to have community champions. So there is this gentleman in Zimbabwe, and it has been an evidence proof tested method, where he saw grandmothers, and he said that within that culture, people don't always open up to maybe a medical professional about deep-rooted mental health concerns, but they will talk to the auntie. So they have literally trained grandmothers who sit at benches on parks to become like community aid champion, first responders to people who come and sit in a park, who might look defeated, might look anxious. They encourage the grandmothers to sit next to them, talk to them. And this has been implemented in so many places, right? Because they understand that by the time we build that healthy, sturdy system of having like dedicated resources for everyone, it's going to take time, and so many people will fall through the cracks. So we do need to have community champions. We do need to train people, and we have a huge group of people who want jobs. You can train people between the echelons of like practitioners and people in need of help and social workers. There can be another layer, right, which can be the community responders, who can do mental welfare checks. We don't have that concept. Like you asked, that what if a person who's living alone has started to display some signs of schizophrenia? Then there is a community wellness check that will register that. They'll be aware of it. So that's, I think, also important. And again, we need a lot of effort towards the rural sector.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, something that we completely neglect, specifically when it comes to mental well-being and mental health. Scherezade, thank you so much for coming and discussing. I think we have discussed a lot. I mean, this could be the one-stop podcast for somebody to understand in depth and in detail. This is such a vast topic that we really want people to understand and digest.